I'm really delighted to be speaking here today. For the last 6 years, I have been sharing my ideas around updating our mental model around multiculturalism in Canada, beyond that to the mosaic, and I've had a chance to speak all over the world and all over Canada. And I haven't had the chance to... No, that's actually a slide.
Oh.
That's okay. But you got the right idea. It's time for an update, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. We planned that. I initially described this update as Multiculturalism 2.0, and in that I describe where multiculturalism is today, and I describe this emergence of a cohort I call cultural navigators. And in 2011, I began speaking about Multiculturalism 3.0, which is a bit more aspirational and explores where we hope multiculturalism will take us. So you can imagine how happy I was when Carmen invited me and when Mark invited me to speak here today. It's actually been a big dream of mine to speak to a large audience in BC. So I've split up my presentation in 3 parts. The first part, I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of some of these ideas and where they've come from, and a little bit about our history and our context of BC. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about what makes Multiculturalism 2.0 distinct. There's a lot of things on this slide, but I'm not going to, unfortunately, don't have a chance to go through all of them. And then I'm going to take you to the paradigm shift of Multiculturalism 3.0. And so just give you an idea of the breakdown. So first, some context. I credit a lot of my ideas around the future and the present state of multiculturalism to the nuances I've observed between different groups of people when I first moved to BC from Regina at the age of 17. Moving to Burnaby, I went to Burnaby South for grade 12, and it was a total culture shock. The summer before, I had spent in Dundurn, Saskatchewan, officially the armpit of Canada. And I really, in the middle of nowhere, I was a recruit in the Army Reserve, and literally the only visible minority in an all-white platoon. I'll give you some time to try to find me. It's kind of like looking for Waldo. I followed my family to Burnaby, where I experienced their conflicting perspectives on my identity. As a teenager growing up in Regina, I never really had any Filipino friends my age, actually. So being at a high school where there were so many Filipinos was really quite novel to me. And I first met the Canadian-born Filipinos, and they'd say things like, "Well, you're not really Canadian, though. After all, you were born in the Philippines." And I thought to myself, man, you guys are idiots. I just spent the entire summer training to fight for Canada, and you're telling me I'm not Canadian? So I looked, and then I saw there was another group of Filipinos. These were the newer immigrant types, and after getting to know them a little bit, they would say things like, "Well, you're not really Filipino. You grew up here, and you can't speak Tagalog." And so I was a little confused as a child and as a teenager. And then I began to realize these two groups didn't really associate. And I remember hearing someone describing for the first time an immigrant student as a fob. And I asked, "What is a fob?" And they responded, fresh off the boat. And to be totally honest, I was floored. I couldn't believe that these Canadian-born Asians could have an attitude towards students who were really only one generation different from them. They had invented these classes of immigrants. And I was fascinated. At the same time, I was repulsed. You see, earlier that summer, I had my first run-in with a card-carrying white supremacist who was around the same age as myself. He was also a recruit who, within a couple of weeks of being at boot camp, let me know he was a card-carrying white supremacist. It's one of those things that white supremacists do. They have to tell you, right? Now, fortunate for me, he wasn't well-liked. He wasn't a very good, to-be soldier, and he was eventually bumped to kitchen duty. But wow, did he hate me, and he told me often. In the middle of training, we were given 1 day of leave in Dundurn, Saskatchewan, and he made clear to me that he and his friends would be looking for me and that I should never be left alone, because if they were to find me, they would kill me. It was very, very simple. What transpired over the next day, really changed me. My fellow recruits got wind of the threat, and they banded around me in a way that sheltered me not just from harm, but empowered me in knowing that racism was not tolerated here. And numerous times, they would randomly come up to me and say, "Alden, you have nothing to worry about. You will never be alone." So where I was from, there were not enough Canadian-born Asians and first-generation Asians to form 2 separate groups. But here I was, trying to make sense of these distinct classes of immigrants within the same ethnic group. I'd had enough Aboriginal friends as a young person to know that this claim of being more Canadian than another immigrant group just over a couple of generations was laughable. These students had no idea that in the larger world, and to white supremacists in general, they were all the same group. And in being divided, they never stood a chance. It wasn't that one group had more or less financial resources or social mobility. It's just that each saw the other as being less. And I share this story because this class rift between ethnic groups didn't go away in the 20 years I lived in Vancouver. That was my hope. It's still here, and I believe it has, in some quietly and in not so quietly ways, grown. This isn't about white Canadians being more tolerant of diversity in Canada anymore, or about accepting diversity moving into their neighborhoods. This is about class. And perhaps multiculturalism in BC has never been about ethnic diversity, but always been about class diversity. How class has been racialized. Struggling to overcome class divisions across and within cultural groups has become, in my opinion, the current and future challenge of multiculturalism, particularly in BC. Now, one of the things that makes BC so interesting is that it is characterized by paradoxes and contradictions. On one hand, Vancouver is North America's capital of mixed-race marriage, and on the other hand, it's known for being one of the hardest places to find a partner. BC is one of the few provinces in Canada with a Multiculturalism Act which requires a head of state on multiculturalism, yet we struggle with issues of racial profiling and ethnic cliquing like no other province. We have a rich history of immigration, and BC's founder, Sir James Douglas, himself was mixed race. He was part Scottish and Guyanese. And it was the migration of Black Americans to BC that prevented BC from being annexed by the United States. But at the same time, paradoxically, we have some of the most racist history in Canada. The Chinese head tax, which would have been collected here. The Komagata Maru of 1914, the forced detainment and exile of Japanese Canadians from BC in 1942. And to this day, we haven't resolved treaty negotiations with most of the First Nations people of this land. In fact, for quite some time, BC prided itself as being the most British of all Canadian provinces. The word British is in our name. So one of the aspects of Vancouver that's received a lot of attention lately is this reputation of being especially cliquey. At first, I thought this was only a Vancouver thing, but I'm hearing that this extends to other cities in British Columbia. There's one great theory that really stands out as to why Vancouver is so cliquey, and I get asked, this is a great topic, at dinner parties and such. According to Dr. Paul Kopis, a political scientist at UBC, the cliquey culture has something to do with the particular kind of European that chose to settle Vancouver, and particularly British Columbia, versus those that settled the prairies in central Canada. If one were to settle on the East Coast, one would have to be comfortable with being bilingual to some degree, because that's the reality of central Canada. If one settled the prairies, they'd have to be comfortable with and possibly marrying into Ukrainian, Russian, and Polish families, as that was the community that was encouraged to move to the prairies. Vancouver, however, allowed British to live out a sense of elitism and segregation that was not possible in the East Coast or the prairies. At least once a year, we'll see an article about ethnic enclaves in the paper, a little bit of fear-mongering. And I have to remind myself, we have some very famous ethnic enclaves, Chinatown, Japantown, but also Kerrisdale and the British properties. These are places where it was not uncommon for the land titles to explicitly state that the sale of property in these areas was not permitted to non-white and non-English. So a settler wanting to live out colonial privilege was able to do so here more than any other province, thereby attracting the kind of European that would want that. So the theory is that over time, new money and new privilege arrived and emerged in Vancouver, and perhaps unknowingly, they adopted and internalized the social norms associated with privilege and class. One of those social habits that appear to have normalized and survived is tightly knit cliques. So far, this is the most compelling theory that I've heard, and it seems to be, at first it seems to be a benign issue, but actually has very considerable repercussions. Multiculturalism's original objective was peaceful and harmonious coexistence between different cultural people in such a way that allowed cultural communities to retain their history, culture, and language of origin while being and feeling unconditionally Canadian. And for decades, we proudly compared this model of integration and cultural retention to the more assimilationist model of the US and Quebec. 40 years ago, this would have appeared like an idealistic goal, but we're in a different place now. We have a different perspective than we had 40 years ago, and in most cases, we've reached this goal of peaceful coexistence. The reality, however, is that it didn't solve all the issues, and we have new ones. Maybe peaceful coexistence isn't actually what we aspire for. There's no doubt that BC is a multicultural place, and I'm sure you would agree with me. We have helped thousands of families from all over the world settle here. But what do we actually mean to achieve through settlement? If we are to consider the future of multiculturalism, we also have to ask ourselves, what is it that we want or need to achieve now? What is the point of all this effort? As many of you know, it's film festival time in Vancouver, and last week I cleared my schedule and I made a point to see one film, and it was called We Were Children, which follows the childhood of two survivors of Indian residential schools in Saskatchewan. And it reminds me of a time that when Canada was signing UN declarations of human rights, children in Canada were suffering in ways that just are unimaginable. I was involved with the coverage of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission at CBC, so I was very familiar with this history. But there was something about this film that made it really real to me. Perhaps it's because I have a 2-year-old son now. And in the bigger picture of Canada, if you compare our challenges with multiculturalism to the damage of the residential schools on our society, multiculturalism seems so very small. This film also reminded me that multiculturalism, like diversity, is not the goal. It's the means to a larger goal. More importantly, the film prompted me to consider whatever it is that we are trying to achieve, it must include the well-being of the first peoples of this land. And this peaceful coexistence thing that we're enjoying isn't addressing this. My son has just turned 2, and I wonder, what is it that we want BC to be when he turns 17, the age that I was when we arrived in BC? And how will multiculturalism contribute to that vision? One of my greatest fears is that he turns to me one day and says, "Dad, I love this place. It's beautiful, it's diverse, all the world lives here. And we still have the best bubble tea in North America. But I have to leave because I want to live in a place where class isn't a big deal, where people can make real friends with each other across diversity, like Calgary." So this brings me to the second thing I would speak about, which is what makes Multiculturalism 2.0 distinct. And don't be scared in thinking that you've missed it. You're living it right now. It's not something you miss or you don't miss. It's just here. And first, I want to acknowledge that we are on a continuum. Multiculturalism is not a static idea. It's on the move. It's evolving. And regardless of whether you choose to move with it or push it forward, it's moving with or without you. And the reason it's a moving target isn't just because it's in our nature as humans to want more, but because multiculturalism is tied to our imaginations. Multiculturalism is more than just an experience or a policy. It's an ideology and an ideal that is tied to how we imagine profoundly different people living and working with one another. And at a more personal level, multiculturalism reflects how we imagine ourselves and our family pictures. So to illustrate this, I'm going to use my Lego set, and if you've seen me speak before, you'll be familiar with this comparison. My father brought this Lego set home one day around 1976, right around the same time as the Multiculturalism Act. Now, this is my original first Lego set, and I love this thing, and I'm not alone. There's a whole community of geeks like me online that are nostalgic about this entire series. And here's an example of the Lego my nephew gave me for my birthday 4 years ago, and I actually think it's quite mind-blowing. This is Japanese manga-inspired exosuit in what we nerds know as combat mech, called it's 7701 Grand Titan, and it's from a set called Exoforce, which ran from 2006 to 2008. You can tell I'm really into this stuff. So, anyways, I'm using this as a metaphor. The thing is, our imaginations are alive. Imaginations evolve. LL918 just doesn't fire up kids today. It's a relic. And in the same way, the mosaic has become a relic. We have sentimental feelings for it, but like my Lego of the 1970s, it fails to capture the Canadian imagination. Canada's urban centers have outgrown both the traditional model of multiculturalism and the conventional language used to describe our contemporary reality, and as a result, many young people struggle using 1970s language and ideas to describe their 21st century diversity. Some of you might recognize this young woman. This is Hanna Simone. She was a Much Music VJ, and she was very much involved in this campaign to ask people to turn off their lights when they weren't using them. Now, Hanna perfectly reflects a new generation of new Canadians with highly complex transcultural identities. She describes her identity online in this way: "I was born in London, England. I then moved to Calgary. I then moved to Saudi Arabia. And when the war broke out, my family moved to Cyprus. After 5 years, I moved to India. I came back to Canada for grade 12. We moved to British Columbia, and then I stayed in the province for university. I did my degree in international relations and political science, then moved to London. I moved to Toronto a couple years later, so I don't really have a hometown per se. My family is my home." So when we ask her where she's from, how do you think she answers? Is she Indian? Is she English? Is she Canadian? More importantly, in today's Canada, does it even matter? And I suspect you all know someone with this level of complexity, and that this level of complexity isn't even that uncommon. The mosaic very simply fails to encompass the contemporary complexity of multi-ethnic and transcultural identities that have become ubiquitous to urban life, not just in Canada, but around the world. Last year, Mitya Soy moved to Toronto from Nanaimo, where she finished a degree in publishing, and she has this great story of going to the Ministry of Transportation in Ontario to get her learner's permit. And after a couple of hours of waiting in line, she discovered that she was refused, to her surprise. She needed 2 pieces of ID, so she provided her agent her BC ID, which apparently isn't recognized in Ontario, and her Russian passport. You see, Mitya is 4th-generation Russian. Now, despite her passport having the appropriate study and work visas, the agent and his manager could not accept Mitya was Russian because of how she looked, and particularly because she spoke perfect Canadian English. They concluded she was a fraud. She also spoke Russian perfectly, and like many new arrivals to Canada, she has often complained to me that she struggles making non-Russian friends. She also struggles finding acceptance in the Russian community in Toronto. They just don't know what to do with her. I have this story of when I climbed into a London cab for the airport. When the cabbie asked why I was in London, I was quick to share that I was there to talk about diversity in Canada. And after about 5 minutes of talking, he turns to me and says, "But you're not really Canadian though, are you?" And I thought, I've heard this before. He assumed that based on my being non-white, that I was not of Canada, and therefore I was not really Canadian. Perhaps in the same way Indian families who've been in England for generations upon generations may not be considered British. Many people struggle with this scrutiny, especially when traveling overseas, because ancestry and ethnicity still define your identity in most places of the world. So I'd like to expose the first problem with the mosaic, or multiculturalism 1.0, that in the mindset of our multiculturalism policy, and likewise the mosaic, you are your ethnicity. You wear your ethnicity, regardless of how little or how much it's actually a part of your everyday life. We know this to be true from the simple question of where you're from. Every once in a while I get asked this. I'll be at a conference and someone asks where I'm from. Being that I've been here 20 years now, I generally answer with Vancouver, and then 50% of the time I get this other question that's, no, I mean, where are you really from? I know what they're asking. I don't like the question. So I generally answer with, well, we moved to Vancouver from Regina. Saskatchewan? Right? And they always have this perplexed look on their face. This is Sarah Leanne. She's also from Vancouver. She's currently living in Toronto. She's been a very successful film and television actor and model in Asia out of Kuala Lumpur, and one of the most blended people I've ever met. She speaks Hokkien, Cantonese, Mandarin, Malay, French, and some Japanese. She was born in Malaysia. Sarah is categorically Chinese-Malaysian, but she's also so Canadian. And in a recent interview with Schema, when asked when she feels the most Canadian, she responded when she watches hockey, especially the Stanley Cup playoffs. Sounds like every other Canadian I know. And this is Alden Pulga. See, I got complaints that there are too many pictures of women in my slides, and so just want to make sure everyone's still with me this morning. Alden Pulga is a childhood friend of mine. He was born and raised in Regina. He spent the last 10 years in Asia, initially as a model and then as a VJ for VH1. In Hong Kong, and later the face for VH1 in the Philippines, so very successful. And he recently moved back to Regina to go back to school, and he's just had this welcomed a beautiful baby girl into the world, born in Norway to a mixed Norwegian-Filipino mother. Now, I've read about his identity academically as something, some vague caught between cultures, and we view terms like hybridity and hyphenated and bicultural, and sometimes he's distastefully referred to as a banana, or in his case, a coconut, which implies, that he's white on the inside. And in reality, none of these terms really work to describe his blended reality. Cultural navigators like Sarah, Alden, and myself struggle with the concept of the mosaic and the multiculturalism policy of Canada because, like the London cabbie, our multiculturalism policy uses ethnicity as the main tag for your identity. Cultural navigators are often 1.5 gens, so those who have immigrated to Canada as young children, second-generation Canadians, those of mixed race, but can also include urban Aboriginal youth, third- and fourth-generation Canadians. And like Hanna Simone, their experience of cultural and social identity is so complex it's often challenging to articulate. By contrast, the ethno-cultural mosaic, or multiculturalism 1.0, relies on clear and simple responses to the question where you're from, which simply doesn't work for most Canadians and transnationals today. I want to talk quickly about the forces that have brought us here, and one of the, of course, is demographics, and we talk a lot about demographics at conferences like this, but I'd like to argue that technology and commerce have actually had a much more influential impact on our rapid adoption of multiculturalism 2.0. Technology is the most transformational of forces affecting our notions of ethnicity and identity, shifting our ideas of how we live with one another, and there's a number of reasons why. First of all, technology is moving at a rate much faster than anything else. It's also driven by commerce, and we tend to celebrate technology as a signal of advancement. Most importantly, technology has enabled us to break the laws of time and space. This is an image of the telectroscope. It's an art installation that in 2008 was put in London and New York, and this is an image of New Yorkers looking at Londoners through what appears to be a tunnel in real time, and they're waving back and forth at each other. It's just a wonderful illustration of how technology facilitates the public imagination. We know that Canadians are not only more culturally diverse than they've ever been, but they're also more technologically savvy, staying connected in real time with family, loved ones, other places in the world, and friends who are possibly in the same room, but also overseas. Now, the Canadian marketplace is another really influential force, and the banks were one of the first places to identify that the Canadian public was changing. And what I love about this particular bank ad is that this could have appeared in either ethnic media or mainstream media, and there's something quite interesting about this woman that makes her quite ethnically ambiguous. But at the same time, there's something about her that feels very local. And what I think what's being acknowledged here is that the diversity of the Canadian market isn't just about targeting new immigrants, but in fact a new financial public. If you look at her name, it's kind of hard to see in the slide. It's Melanie Chong, and we're all smart. We know where Chong comes from. There's an assumption that she is some kind of Chinese, and it also says that she's been a customer for 30 years, and so there might be something that she's been in Canada since she was a child. And in 2003, this reality of new mixed race and 1.5 and second generation and urban Aboriginal youth was called the New Canada by the Globe and Mail. And one of the things that make Multiculturalism 2.0 distinct is this paradigm shift around attitudes towards ethnicity. As part of this book, Ipsos Reid conducted a study for the Centre for Research and Information on Canada and the Globe and Mail, and amongst many of their findings, the study found a major shift in Canadians' attitudes towards ethnicity. When asked how important ethnic background was when choosing a spouse, Canadians said ethnic background was in fact the least important, while attitudes towards family and children were the most important. Now, this doesn't suggest that cultural similarities are unimportant, but what this means is that Canadians are comfortable with ethnic and racial diversity, but attitudes towards family and morals have to be compatible. What this demonstrates is that Canadians are able to separate ethnicity from values. One might interpret this to mean that Canadians define themselves by their values as opposed to their ethnicity. Now, we take this very much for granted in urban centers of Canada, but for many countries in Asia, and particularly in Europe, and in some of our neoconservativist ethno-burbs in BC, ancestry still determines your identity. And this is very important to note because one of the places where xenophobia will often manifest itself is at the prospect of interracial marriage. What's most interesting to me recently is that this attitude, this very Canadian attitude, is becoming mainstream in the US. In May 2011, the Poynter Institute published this article saying young people of color see ethnicity as both cool and fluid since so many of them are of multiple cultures and races. This is a generation for whom identity is a choice. And this is like a new novel thing in the United States, but we of course have known this to be true in Canada for decades. So the good news is that overall mixed race relationships and mixed ethnic people are mainstream in Canada and becoming more mainstream in the US. And I'm constantly looking for evidence of attitudinal shifts in pop culture. And last February, Archie Comics announced that the love triangle between Archie, Betty, and Veronica was over, had come to an end. Archie had married Valerie Smith, a noticeable black character from Josie and the Pussycats. And moreover, they have this mixed race child. You can see her right here. She has red hair and she's dark-skinned. I've never seen a child like that, so it's just kind of interesting. It's part of my imagination now. And in case you didn't know, in August of 2010, Marvel released a modern contemporary Spider-Man. Peter Parker was replaced by Miles Morales, who is mixed ethnicity, half black and half Latino. So this brings me to one of the most unique paradoxes emblematic of Canada, a paradox most Canadians often take for granted, and perhaps something we could better explain to new and potential immigrants. Despite ethnic background not being a factor in choosing a spouse, according to the same 2003 study, ethnicity remained important to identity, especially for ethnic minorities. So if you look a little closer, the dark bars represent those who answered that ethnicity was important to their identity, which basically is everyone, and the light gray bars reflect those who felt ethnicity was important when choosing a life partner. And you can see, particularly for all respondents, there's this huge gap. Now, anecdotally, the communities that get this the most when I talk about this are Aboriginal communities. Marrying into a different Aboriginal family or non-Aboriginal family doesn't impact one being fiercely Aboriginal. I've covered the emergence of cultural navigators, the influence of technology, the shift in attitude towards ethnicity is a core aspect of Multiculturalism 2.0, and I've been building towards what makes ethno-cultural mosaic, the ethno-cultural mosaic obsolete. And there are 3 new features to Multiculturalism 2.0 that illustrate why the mosaic is functionally obsolete. The first feature is that ethnicity informs one's cultural identity but does not define it. And I'm alluding to this from the number of examples that I've shared with you. Now, this is a major shift from 1.0. In contrast, the mosaic model is essentialist, and like I said earlier, it assumes that you are defined by your ancestry regardless of how little or how much is a part of your everyday life. And this model has become problematic for most Canadians with complex cultural identities. To illustrate this, I use the example of Barack Obama, who in 2008, during his presidential campaign, in an interview responding to the question, how being a black man has affected his campaign and aspirations to become the next president, he responded with, "My being black informs who I am, but no longer defines who I am." My being black informs who I am, but no longer defines who I am. Now, in the same way, I don't want you to pretend that I'm not brown-skinned or that I'm not of Filipino descent. I want you to see that I'm brown. Neither would I expect you to think that my being visibly brown is not important to me as the myth of colorblindness might suggest. My being brown is very important to me. It's my natural state. And I've been brown for a long time. Rather, like President Obama, my being an ethnic minority or a person of color informs who I am, but no longer defines who I am. Secondly, cultural identity is fluid. It's situational and it varies by context, and we know this. This is very simple, common sense stuff. And the mosaic assumes your cultural identity is static. It's a rigid model. In reality, our identities are organic. Our identities change from moment to moment. And third, our identities are shaped by far more than ancestry. We are a collective mashup of our heritage and the cultural spaces of our work and our education, where we live, for example. The mosaic, being based on ethnic allegiance, assumes all this other stuff that makes up one's cultural identity, like toys, do not matter. This is my son's collection of Green Lantern. He recently gone through a Green Lantern phase, and I made sure that he had a black Green Lantern as well, because there is one. Now, the mosaic doesn't have room for things like hockey, and clearly hockey is a part of the Canadian and Vancouver cultural identity, and we often hear people talk about hockey being part of the Canadian cultural fabric. In 2007, the CBC commissioned a 2-year study. So each year, the study would survey 50,000 people from an organization called Print Measurement Bureau around Hockey Night in Canada, and it found that Aboriginal audiences are the most likely to watch hockey than any other ethnic group, with the exception to South Asians and Filipinos. This study triggered the creation of Hockey Night in Canada in Punjabi. I've been thinking about this. Do Aboriginal communities' propensity to watch hockey make them more Canadian? Or does it make us more Aboriginal? When we hear that immigrant families watch hockey, we have this proud feeling like we have more in common with them. But does that same emotional connection occur knowing that Aboriginal people are 30% more likely to watch Hockey Night in Canada than white audiences? Just a thought. What Multiculturalism 2.0 accounts for is that one's cultural identity is an organic collection of the cultural spaces and the cultural things that we navigate. For some, the challenge is rethinking how we understand people and ourselves, no longer through the lens of ethnicity or ancestry. Now, I have to admit, Multiculturalism 2.0 still has some bugs. It's complicated. Not everyone is ready for this update, and there's still a lot of well-hidden xenophobia and growing neoconservatism in Canada. But I hope I've given you some insight to how multiculturalism has evolved in the last 40 years. I especially hope it's clear that we moved past the mosaic. So this brings me to the third part of my keynote, the jump to Multiculturalism 3.0. As an update, Multiculturalism 3.0 addresses 2 things. First, it looks at the question of what exactly are we trying to achieve now? As our public imagination has evolved and as we have gained new knowledge about how multiculturalism works, what do we aspire multiculturalism to produce? Secondly, Multiculturalism 3.0 gives us more language to describe in greater depth the attributes that give cultural navigators a heightened sense of cultural mobility, what we are calling at UBC intercultural fluency. Unfortunately, I only have time to speak to the first point, but I actually think it's the more important one. Similar to the attitudinal shift about ethnicity that characterized Multiculturalism 2.0, there are 2 slight shifts in thinking about multiculturalism needed to approach this question of what we're trying to achieve through multiculturalism beyond the mosaic and peaceful coexistence. The first shift is seeing multiculturalism as no longer being a social experiment. In the book, The New Canada, Canadian cities are described as a true national experiment of how equitably and authentically mix of how to equitably and authentically mix a diverse population in one space. And I would argue that we are no longer in the experiment stage of the recent past. We know some things now. We have more experience and hands-on knowledge of how to foster an inclusive and diverse community than we ever have in the past. And to continue with the frame of mind that we're still experimenting, this absolves us of being truly responsible for our decisions. First of all, what we've learned at UBC is that, and what recent research is telling us, is that you can be a very diverse place with people from all over the world, peacefully coexisting, or at least appearing that way, but that this does not mean the people in this place or on this campus exchange ideas or even get to know each other. The amount of diversity does not guarantee that students on a campus will graduate with a depth of understanding of the difference or with the differences of each other. In other words, contact with diversity does not guarantee intercultural understanding. Secondly, we've learned that where dynamic intercultural interactions and experiences occur, that they are by design. It is intentional. And when left to chance, it will often produce what students have identified as ethnic cliquing. Now, this knowledge has exposed another one of the great myths of multiculturalism, that profoundly different people will work it out on their own. In fact, without support, without facilitation and intentional design, they generally don't. What happens is instead is isolation and disconnect from other groups. And research has shown us that contact with diversity does not on its own produce self-awareness or a depth of understanding. Thirdly, we know that knowledge about racism doesn't necessarily reduce it. Intercultural experts are now saying that the past few decades' efforts to raise students' cognitive understanding of racism has not actually reduced racism on campus. The two things that actually eliminate racism is the increase of empathy and the reduction of anxieties, and I'm sure you all know this from your own work. We now know that there's a correlation between social anxiety about the economy, about jobs or competition, for example, and racism. The more anxious people are, the more likely they are to see things through a racist lens. Fourth, we know about the impact of residential schools. The Canadian history about neglect, abuses, and racism about Aboriginal people is becoming part of the public consciousness. And like all things in our biosphere, we are all connected. And if we truly understand this, then we also know the damage to Aboriginal families and communities as a result of residential schools affects all of us. Now that we know this, we can no longer ignore this. We can no longer pretend that the future of multiculturalism isn't somehow connected to the health of Aboriginal communities in the province. There are other things we know, but these four are more than enough to transform the work that we do in the area of immigration and cultural diversity. The second necessary shift in thinking about multiculturalism is reframing multiculturalism into the space of social sustainability. If social sustainability is a new concept for you, allow me to give you a little quick overview. Social sustainability is one of three kinds of sustainability: ecological, economic, and third, social. It includes social essentials like access to daycare, green spaces, housing, and clean water, but it also includes what we call people tech, the people aspect of sustainability, how people interact and live with one another, and how much they feel they belong. What sustainability experts like John Robinson at UBC are referring to as regenerative communities, which is an extension of this idea of regenerative design, or the concept in building and systems design that generates positive benefits for people and the environment. So for example, the SIRS building at UBC, which is the greenest building in North America, it produces more clean water and more energy than it consumes. It literally takes the exhaust from neighboring buildings and converts it into electricity. The idea is that communities can also be regenerative. Regenerative communities produce more positive than negative. Now imagine a community that's so robust, so inclusive, so flexible, that it has the capacity to take people struggling with language and integration and convert them into socially mobile and highly functional and contributing citizens. So rather than pigeonholing the work around immigration and settlement into the space of diversity and multiculturalism, we need to recognize this work as fostering social sustainability, contributing towards the building of regenerative communities and workplaces, and doing all sorts of things to make more dynamic the human interaction in communities and making stronger the bonds of community cohesion. I'd like you to remember this phrase: dynamic human interaction and community cohesion. The extent to which people engage with one another and the degree to which diverse communities stick together, these two attributes are essential to regenerative communities. Now, this shift of multiculturalism towards social sustainability is not actually my idea. It's not a new idea in the province. In 2008, the Welcoming and Inclusive Communities and Workplaces program prepared a research framework for the Ministry of Advanced Education and Labor Market Development, an initiative of Embrace BC's predecessor, which was then called Welcome BC. The research framework included a conceptual framework of urban social sustainability. It described sustainability in the following way. Cities achieve social sustainability when citizens' basic needs are met, when they have equal access to opportunities, when people live together in harmony, and when everyone is able and welcome to participate fully in the economic, social, and political life of a community. A sustainable city is a city that is fully inclusive. Inclusion means that each person's participation and contributions are welcomed, recognized, and valued. So we are now in a position to decide what kind of multiculturalism we want BC to be. One that produces what appears to be peaceful coexistence, or one that forms meaningful bonds between profoundly different groups of people. Now, arguably, 1.0 was never really designed to do more than foster peaceful coexistence. However, now that we're here, and like I said, we have a new perspective on this horizon, our imaginations demand more. As we adjust our frame of mind to aspirations for social sustainability, we will need to be more intentional about fostering dynamic human interaction and community cohesion. We will need to move beyond cognitive knowledge of racism, and we will need to acknowledge that the healing of Aboriginal communities is part of our sustainability. And we will need to get better at being an interfaith place. This aspirational effort will require a reimagining of the family picture in Canada, and most importantly, a heightened sense of urgency. This brings me back to my story about moving here 20 years ago, discovering that rift between classes of immigrants in high school. The current and future challenge of multiculturalism in BC is exposing and overcoming the barriers that persist due to class divisions within and across cultures. Now, if you've heard me speak before, you'll be familiar with this image. This is a class photo for my grade 3 class in Edmonton. And I love this image because I don't remember my class being this diverse. In grade 3, we didn't see difference as diversity per se. These were just characteristics that distinguished you from me and me from you. And this is partly why the idea of colorblindness is again a myth. I remember having classmates from all over the world, from Africa, from El Salvador. I had Aboriginal classmates. I had hyper ones, I had quiet ones. But there was no value associated with being different from one another. But something happens between grade 3 and grade 6. And I share this story of my grade 6 Halloween, right around the same time of year, when some of my closest friends came up to me and said that I could no longer be Superman or Batman for Halloween. And when I asked why, they innocently said because I wasn't white. And it wasn't that I was hurt, I was just confused, and I was confused by how confident they were with their answer. I was also told that I could no longer be Indiana Jones when we played Raiders of the Lost Ark at recess. Instead, I could be his little Asian sidekick that would yell out, "Mr. Jones, Mr. Jones." Not so good for me. In some ways, the future of multiculturalism requires us going back to this place of grade 3 and addressing the myth that would suggest that we as children just figured this out on our own. But we all know better now, and that's what makes 3.0 so interesting. That wasn't the case at all. We didn't figure it out on our own. It was our grade 3 teacher. She set the rules. She set the guidelines for equality. She set us up to succeed and thrive in a multicultural place by design. It's my hope that today and tomorrow's symposium inspires you to persevere as champions for social cohesion, and that you are confident in knowing that your work is as essential to the future sustainability of British Columbia as our economy. Thank you.